right, and we are recording. This is my review and reflect for week 4 of phase 0 with Devbootcamp. So I'm going to pull up this classy little list. Let's start answering questions about what we did this week with Ruby. So the first section is variables, and the first question is, what is a variable, and why might a programmer use a variable? So basically, a variable is a piece of information you've assigned a name. And at least with local variables, what you do is you have like a lowercase word. And it's fine though, you can write dog and then using the equal sign you assign a value and say like equals and then in quotations cat, which means you're saying that every time dog comes up in the program, the word cat is what's in the place of it. So it's just a way of organizing information where you can recall it later in the program. But you just have that label you just type in and then it calls up whatever that piece of information is. And the second part of variables, rather than the first question, why might a programmer use a variable? It's nicer to just have a variable rather than retyping the same value again and again and again. Variables, you can also plug in the methods. And variables are nice in that you can change the value later on, or you can like change the value under specific conditions. So it allows you to manipulate the data you've already assigned to it. Second question, if the value of first underscore name is Abraham and last underscore name is Lincoln, explain the order in which Ruby will run the full name, or the line full name equals first name plus last name, and what the final result will be. Okay, if you do this, so you have two strings, one is Abraham in quotes and the other is Lincoln in quotes, which a string is like a written form of information, like words or phrases. So if you combine those two values, what's going to happen? Well, first, it's the right side of the equation is going to be resolved. So on the left side, you have full name, which is the variable you're assigning a value to. But then on the right, you have first name plus last name. So first, that's going to be resolved, in which you'll have Abraham and then Lincoln immediately without a space, because the example provided, there isn't a space after Abraham in the quotes. So I'll just put them together as like a single word. And then once it's settled what is happening on the right side of the equation, that's when it gets assigned to the left side of the equation. So the final result is full name will equal a string that is Abraham Lincoln, but with no space in it. Okay, next section, data types. For each of the following data types, write a short definition. Give at least one example when you might use it. Okay, so the first one is string, which we've already talked about. A string is like any written word or phrase. Basically any written text, and you'll put it in quotations, because otherwise Ruby's going to think it's a variable or a method you're calling it, but you have to put it in quotes. But yeah, any kind of written phrase. And why would you use that? Okay, if you want to ask your user for input that's using the program, then you would write a string, and then you would use put string. It would display that text or that prompt to the user, telling them what you're asking for them to provide, and then they provide it. The next thing is integer. Integer is, it's exactly like in math. Any number, no like fractional or decimal numbers, but any positive or negative number, and the number 0. Why would you use that? It's really good for counters. Like if you have a loop and you want to break the loop, eventually you'd use like equal plus 1 or equal minus 1. So like each time these conditions come through, then like say the 5th time the loop breaks, you can use the integers as a counter. And obviously you can also use integers for any kind of basic math you want to do in your program. And then what is a float? A float is a number that uses decimals. So like 1.3 or 6.7. And again, maybe if you have like some kind of program that is calculating finances or currency, you would need to be able to use decimal points to express cents. Nil's an interesting value because nil means nothing is there. and it doesn't mean zero. That zero is a number, zero is an integer. But nil, so why would you use that? You might have a survey form, and then if there's a not applicable section where the user just doesn't input anything, then nil is the value you're going to put there. Next is Boolean. Boolean is either true or false, and then that comes a lot when you're using flow control. Booleans are really useful. But yeah, basically a Boolean is like either a true or a false piece of information. Okay, the next section, algorithms. What is an algorithm? An algorithm is basically like a laundry list of how you accomplish a task. So like if you have like, okay, drink tea out of a mug, then like the first step might be make tea, which could be an entire algorithm in itself, how to make tea. So like make tea, pour it in the mug, and then like enjoy it. And then when the mug is empty, like either refill it or clean the mug. Or just let it sit around because maybe you're not a clean person. I personally am, but I'm not judging you. Yeah, and algorithms are great because like when you're building a piece of code, before you code it, it's oftentimes useful to break down exactly what you need to do first. So you're like, okay, I need a method that decides or asks the user if the shirt is yellow. And then they'll type in a yes or a no, and that's like, okay, so, or like, how do we do that? How do we prompt them for that? How do we get the information? And then the next step is like, okay, well, if it's yellow, we're going to do this with a shirt, probably burn it because why wear a yellow shirt? And if it's not yellow, then we're okay. Let's see. Okay, yeah. What are two common categories of algorithms in computer science? Okay, so like sort and search is a really common feature, which is kind of like, imagine if you have a library full of books. Sort is how you would arrange the books in the sections, like different sections in the library. And then the searching is you're like actually searching in a given section. So that's used for sorting and like searching through huge databases for specific pieces of information. You also have like encryption programs and decryption programs. So, yeah. And algorithms, it's just kind of like they keep happening again and again and again. So, okay, methods. Question number 6. What is a method and why might a programmer choose to use a method? Okay, a method is basically any piece of code that you're going to use again and again. I'm adjusting this camera because it's driving me crazy, like looking to the left and seeing myself and not center. A method is basically a repeatable piece of code in your Ruby where you can just call it repeatedly. And I guess that's why might a programmer choose to use a method. Like, because it's like maybe 3 pieces of code put together, it's a procedure of steps. And every time you type in that method, those are procedures of steps that are going to be used with the input argument. Which goes to the next thing. Define the following terms as they relate to a method. Return value. Okay, every method has a return value, and it's an implicit return, which is the last term, because you don't request it, and it's the realization of the last line of the method. So a lot of times you'll get nil. Like if you're not doing something like really specific, but so like if the last line would be x plus y, then the answer to x plus y might be the implicit return. I think that's right. It might produce nil if it's 2 strings, but I think it just produces a result. Side effect. Okay, a side effect is something that doesn't like functionally do anything to code, but it's usually more for interacting with users. So that would be like puts, where you're displaying a phrase so that the user like has a sense of what's going on at that stage of the code, but it's not actually changing anything. You're not changing any values. You're not doing any calculations. Okay, a parameter in a method is when you define the method, it's going to be what's in parentheses, which it could be X, it could be whatever piece of information you want in there, just like a descriptor. And so when you're writing the code, the parameter is what you're saying will get plugged into the method and then have all these steps happen with it. Whereas the argument is the actual piece of information someone does input into the method. So like later in the code, when you call up the method, whatever you put in parentheses there, that is the argument that's being provided. And I already talked about implicit return. And the difference between implicit and explicit return is an explicit return would be if you wrote like P and then whatever specific thing you're trying to recall. Whereas implicit return, you're not requesting a return from Ruby, but you're still getting the last line of the method fired back here, or the result of the last line of the method, last step of the method. What are global scope and method scope? How do scopes impact the availability of data at different points in the program? All right, so if you have variables you're assigning values to, and the software gets big enough, that could eventually become a problem if a lot of people are like, oh, I'm just going to use X, or I'm going to write history or something, and it's a tag everyone's using, especially if you have different people working on the project. If every time that variable got assigned a value, it changed, that would be a problem later on in the code, or earlier in the code. Like, you'd be interfering with each other's programs. So basically a method scope is if in the middle of a method you say, like, you're building a counter and you say like x equals 0 and then x equal plus 1 later on, that only affects x within the method itself. But if someone wrote x as a variable later on, it's not going to have any impact on a global level. Whereas global scope, it would be like a variable that I think it's different from a constant. Like, a constant is like something you only assign a value once, and then that's what it is for the entire program in Ruby. But like a global scope is, I think it's the $ you use for it, whereas like local variables are just like lowercase words, or underscore and then a word, which could be uppercase at that point. So yeah, it's basically just, you don't want to have information screwing with information in other parts, variables messing with each other, different parts if people are using the values again. But there are certain variables you want to have like in a broader sense throughout the program, and then you'd use a global variable instead. Control flow. What is control flow, and why might a programmer choose to use flow control? So when you originally write with Ruby, if you just say like 2 plus 2, then you'll get 4. And like Ruby likes to execute like just straight down the list, and everything's going to happen. But then there might be a situation where you're like, well, I only want to do this under these circumstances. And this is where flow control comes in. And a lot of loops and else if statements, which is next. Which is 10, is define the following terms as they relate to flow control. So loop. A loop is a set of conditions that keep on happening. Or a loop is like it could be, yeah, it's a procedure of like code that keeps executing either while a set of conditions is happening, which is one of the loops is down there, which a while condition is like as long as this statement is true, or you could write it as long as this statement is false, keep running this series of code, and then you would end it at the end. And with all these terms, you need to type end at the end of the loops so that you know to break it. And then there's the until loop, which you're saying until this parameter is true or until this parameter is false, keep executing this series of code. And then the other examples here, if, else, else if, and while. Oh, wait, no, not while. I already did that. So if is an if statement where you write if this is true, or you could say if this is not true, do this in the code. And then the next line would be, if you only had 2 statements, the second line would be else. So you're like, if this happens, do this. Else, which you could also think of as otherwise, do this. And then else if is if you want to have multiple, like more than 2 options. And then you could say, if this is true, do this. Else if this other statement is true or false, do this code. Else, like if the other situations just aren't true or they don't apply, then do this final option instead. So you're kind of like branching a tree of paths that you can do using if, else, else if. And then there's also, I haven't used it in a while, it's like case is another thing. I didn't read up on it again for this, but it's not on here. So I'm going to close this video. Whoever's reviewing this, I'm sorry, this is like 15 minutes. But this is way better review than just writing the stuff because you got to know it. I hope you're having a great week, everyone that's watching this, and I'm excited for the next week of Ruby.